On a quiet, palm-lined street in Beverly Hills, behind tall iron gates and manicured hedges, stood a mansion that looked like success itself. From the outside, it was the American dream carved in white stone and glass, wealth, prestige, and power wrapped neatly into one address. This was the home of Jose and Kitty Menendez, and to the world, they were the definition of a perfect family. Jose Menendez was a self-made man, a Cuban immigrant who had clawed his way to the top of the entertainment industry. As an executive at RCA Records, he was respected, feared, and admired. He demanded excellence from everyone around him, especially from his two sons, Lyle and Erik. To Jose, weakness was unacceptable. Failure was shameful. Love, if it existed at all, was conditional. Kitty Menendez played the role of the elegant Beverly Hills wife flawlessly. She attended charity events, smiled for photographs, and hosted dinners where crystal glasses clinked beneath chandeliers. But behind closed doors, those smiles often faded. Friends later described her as fragile, emotionally distant, and increasingly dependent on medication. She adored her sons, but she also seemed lost, trapped in a life that looked perfect but felt empty. Lyle, the older brother, learned early how to perform confidence. He was loud, charming, and assertive, the kind of boy who filled a room just by walking into it. Erik, younger and more sensitive, retreated inward. He struggled in school, battled anxiety, and found refuge in music and tennis. The brothers were close, bonded not just by blood, but by the pressure cooker they grew up in. From a young age, Jose pushed them relentlessly. Tennis lessons at dawn, tutors after school, criticism that cut deeper than any punishment. Winning was expected. Anything less was humiliation. To the outside world, it looked like discipline. To the boys, it felt like suffocation. As they grew older, the tension inside the Menendez household intensified. Arguments echoed through the halls, doors slammed, fear became routine. Later, the brothers would claim that what happened in that house went far beyond emotional cruelty, that it crossed into years of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. They would say they lived in constant terror, controlled by a father who ruled through intimidation and a mother who either couldn't or wouldn't protect them. But in 1989, no one outside those walls knew any of that. To neighbors, the Menendezes were wealthy, private, and unremarkable, just another powerful family in Beverly Hills, until the night everything shattered. On August 20th, 1989, Jose and Kitty Menendez sat in their living room watching television. It was a quiet Sunday evening, the kind of ordinary moment no one remembers unless it becomes the last moment of their lives. Without warning, the sound of shotgun blasts ripped through the mansion. Multiple shots, deafening, relentless. Jose was hit first. Kitty tried to run. She didn't make it far. When the noise stopped, the room was soaked in blood, furniture destroyed, walls scarred. It was a massacre, not a robbery, not an accident. Whoever did this had intended to kill and to make sure there was no survival. Hours later, Lyle Menendez called 911, his voice frantic, almost hysterical. He told the operator his parents had been shot. He cried, he screamed, he sounded like a son who had just discovered the unthinkable. Police arrived to a scene that defied easy explanation. There were no signs of forced entry, no valuables taken, no clear suspects. At first, investigators treated Lyle and Erik as victims, but cracks appeared quickly. In the days following the murders, the brothers didn't behave the way grieving sons were expected to behave. Instead of withdrawing, they began spending lavishly. Rolex watches, designer clothes, luxury cars, expensive dinners. Erik hired a private tennis coach. Lyle bought a Porsche and talked about opening a restaurant. When Erik Menendez finally broke down in his therapist's office, it wasn't the kind of confession people expect from a cold-blooded killer. It was messy, emotional, filled with fear and guilt. He told his therapist that he and his brother had killed their parents, and once those words were spoken, they could never be taken back. The therapist, bound by law, eventually shared the tapes with authorities. The brothers were arrested, handcuffed, photographed, their faces splashed across every newspaper in America. At first, prosecutors believed they had an open and shut case: 2 wealthy sons, 2 dead parents, a massive inheritance, and evidence of extravagant spending immediately after the murders. The motive, they argued, was obvious: greed. But once the trial began, the story twisted into something far more disturbing. Lyle and Erik's defense attorneys presented a narrative of years of abuse, graphic, horrifying, and deeply unsettling. They claimed Jose Menendez had sexually abused both sons for years, using fear and control to keep them silent. They painted Kitty as unstable, emotionally abusive, and complicit through her inaction. According to the defense, the brothers believed their parents were about to kill them to keep the abuse secret. The murders, they argued, were not about money, but survival. America was transfixed. Courtroom testimony described nights of terror, threats whispered behind closed doors, and a household ruled by silence and shame. Erik cried on the stand. Lyle spoke with rage and defiance. Some viewers believed them completely. Others saw performance. Prosecutors pushed back hard. They presented evidence of planning: shotguns purchased days earlier, ammunition bought under false pretenses, rehearsed alibis. They argued that the abuse claims were exaggerated or fabricated after the fact, a desperate attempt to justify murder. They returned again and again to the spending spree. If the brothers were so traumatized, prosecutors asked, why did they celebrate afterward? Why did they shop, travel, and indulge as if freed from something? The trials ended in mistrials. Juries couldn't agree. But the second trial was different. This time, much of the abuse testimony was limited. The focus shifted back to planning, money, and motive. And this time, the jury convicted both brothers of first-degree murder. Life without parole. The verdict sent shockwaves through the country. Some felt justice had finally been served. Others believed 2 deeply damaged men had been condemned without compassion. The Menendez brothers were sent to prison, separated at first, then later reunited behind bars. And the mansion in Beverly Hills became just another property. Prison stripped away everything the Menendez brothers once had: wealth, status, privacy. Gone were the tailored suits and luxury cars. In their place, concrete walls, rigid routines, and endless time to think. Years turned into decades. Lyle became involved in inmate advocacy. Erik found solace in art and education. Both married while incarcerated. Both maintained their innocence, or at least their justification for the killings. Outside prison walls, public opinion continued to evolve. Documentaries resurfaced the case. New generations questioned whether the justice system had truly listened. Conversations about male abuse victims became more open, something nearly unthinkable in 1989. And yet, the question remained unresolved. Were Lyle and Erik Menendez desperate sons acting out of terror? Or were they calculating heirs who saw murder as the fastest path to freedom and fortune? Perhaps the truth exists somewhere in between: a toxic household, unbearable pressure, genuine trauma, and a choice that can never be undone. What is certain is this: on one August night in Beverly Hills, a family destroyed itself from the inside out, and the echo of those gunshots still reverberates through courtrooms, prisons, and the collective memory of a nation obsessed with wealth, power, and betrayal. By the time the second trial began, the Menendez case was no longer just a courtroom battle. It had become a national spectacle. Television cameras lined the courthouse steps. Late-night comedians mocked the brothers. Tabloids printed exaggerated headlines, framing the case as a twisted soap opera of privilege and violence. America wasn't just watching, it was judging. The prosecution entered the second trial determined to control the narrative. They knew the first trial had slipped away from them because of emotion. Too many tears, too many disturbing details, too much room for sympathy. This time, they wanted precision, structure, cold logic. They reduced the abuse testimony to its bare minimum: no graphic descriptions, no extended emotional breakdowns. Instead, they focused on timelines, receipts, and decisions. They showed how the brothers bought shotguns days before the murders using false identification, how they practiced reloading, how they fired multiple rounds even after their parents were clearly incapacitated. This, the prosecution argued, was not panic. This was execution. Psychologists were brought in to dissect the brothers' behavior. Lyle's confidence was reframed as narcissism. Erik's vulnerability was painted as manipulation. Prosecutors suggested that years of wealth had insulated the brothers from consequences, creating a belief that they could control any situation, even murder. They emphasized the spending again and again. The Rolex watches gleamed under courtroom lights. The Porsche was described in loving detail. The vacations, the restaurants, the tennis coach. To the prosecution, these weren't distractions. They were proof. Proof that once their parents were gone, the brothers felt not fear, but relief. The defense fought back with what they had left. They argued that trauma doesn't disappear just because someone smiles, that abuse victims don't all grieve the same way, that sudden freedom can feel intoxicating after years of control. They reminded the jury that fear doesn't always look like fear, that sometimes it looks like reckless behavior, denial, and emotional numbness. But the mood had changed. The jury was quieter, more skeptical, less moved by tears. And when the guilty verdicts were finally read, the brothers showed little reaction. No screams, no collapse, just stillness, as if something inside them had already accepted the outcome long before the judge spoke. Life without the possibility of parole. The courtroom emptied, the cameras moved on. But the story did not end there. Prison is designed to erase individuality. Haircuts are uniform, clothing is identical, days blur together in repetition. For men who once lived behind gates and drove luxury cars, the adjustment was brutal. At first, Lyle and Erik were sent to separate prisons. The separation was devastating. For most of their lives, they had relied on each other, not just as brothers, but as emotional lifelines. Alone, the silence became unbearable. Letters replaced conversations. Years passed measured not by holidays or birthdays, but by inmate transfers and court filings. Lyle adapted by asserting structure. He followed rules. He mentored other inmates. He became known as disciplined, controlled, and outspoken. Some guards respected him. Others distrusted his confidence. Erik withdrew. He struggled with depression. He found comfort in education, eventually earning degrees behind bars. He painted. He wrote. He clung to routine as a way to quiet his thoughts. In interviews from prison, Erik spoke softly, carefully. He acknowledged responsibility for the killings, but insisted on the truth of the abuse. Lyle, more guarded, framed the murders as a tragic consequence of years of fear and control. They never denied pulling the triggers. They denied the motive. Years later, after long legal battles, the brothers were finally housed in the same facility. When they saw each other again, older, thinner, grayer, it was not dramatic, no embrace caught on camera, just a quiet recognition of shared history and shared fate. Outside prison walls, something unexpected happened. Public opinion began to shift. New documentaries revisited the case with modern eyes. Conversations around childhood abuse, especially involving boys, had changed. What once sounded unbelievable now sounded disturbingly familiar to many viewers. Former classmates came forward, family members spoke out. Small details that once seemed irrelevant took on new meaning. Still, the legal outcome remained unchanged. The Menendez brothers stayed behind bars, and the question that haunted the case refused to disappear. The Menendez case endures because it refuses simplicity. It does not fit neatly into the category of monsters or martyrs. It exists in the uncomfortable space between trauma and responsibility, between sympathy and condemnation. Two sons killed their parents. That fact cannot be erased. But the reasons why, those remain contested, debated, and deeply personal depending on who is asked. If the murders were driven by greed, then the story is a cautionary tale about entitlement and moral decay. A warning about what happens when wealth replaces values and power replaces love. If the murders were driven by fear, then the story is a tragedy of failure, of institutions, of silence, of a society unwilling to see abuse unless it fits a familiar narrative. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps years of psychological damage collided with opportunity. Perhaps trauma and money became tangled together in ways even the brothers themselves couldn't fully understand. What remains undeniable is this. Once the trigger was pulled, there was no path forward that did not end in loss. Jose and Kitty Menendez lost their lives. Lyle and Erik lost their freedom, and the illusion of the perfect American family was shattered forever. In Beverly Hills, new families live in grand homes. New children grow up behind gates. The Menendez mansion exists now only as a footnote in real estate listings. But the story lingers. In court transcripts, in prison cells, in documentaries watched late at night, and in the unanswered question that still echoes decades later. When fear, power, money, and silence collide, where does responsibility truly begin? The Menendez story does not end with a twist, a revelation, or a late-night confession. It ends the way many real stories do, quietly, unresolved, and heavy with consequences that cannot be undone. Two parents were buried in the ground. Two sons were buried behind concrete walls. No verdict, no documentary, no opinion can bring Jose and Kitty Menendez back to life. No amount of reflection can return Lyle and Erik to the moment before the guns were raised, before a single decision destroyed an entire family forever. What remains is not justice or revenge, but aftermath. A house that once symbolized power and success became a crime scene, then a headline, then a memory. Wealth that once promised freedom became meaningless. Fame turned into infamy, and a family that once appeared untouchable collapsed in a single night. Some will always see the Menendez brothers as cold, calculating killers who murdered for money. Others will always see them as damaged sons who snapped under years of fear and control. The truth, whatever it fully is, now lives only in memories, testimony, and silence. But one lesson stands unshaken. Violence does not erase trauma. Money does not heal damage, and killing the source of pain does not end suffering, it only multiplies it. In prison cells, time moves slowly. Decades pass, reflections deepen, and every day begins the same way it always has, with the weight of choices that cannot be taken back. The Menendez brothers will grow old behind bars. Their parents will remain frozen in the final moments of their lives, and the world will continue to debate a tragedy that had no winners. This is not a story about justice. It is a story about what happens when silence lasts too long, power goes unchecked, and the breaking point is finally reached. And in the end, all that is left is loss.